this down here to my level here. So I actually, like I said, Lou said I boomerang back here. I've worked around the country. I did the time zone tour after grad school, worked in upstate New York. I worked in Colorado, and then I was in Milwaukee right before I came back here for several years. And when I was in Milwaukee, the first thing I was told to do was go make a bike share system when I got there in early 2013. And so between that time and when I came back here in late 2016, we built a bike share system, or at least the first about third of a bike share system. About 60 stations were on the ground between 2014 and 2016, and probably will go to about a 180 to 200 station system over there. So some of the stuff that I've put in here is from my experience there as well. It's bike shares is kind of a small world, and it's a changing world, and you tend to know a lot of people around the country because you need to learn from them very fast. It's a industry that's innovating quite rapidly, some of it positively and some of it not so positively. And so that'll be part of the conversation today as well. And how I package this is that we've gone through a bike share feasibility study here in Grand Rapids now. We're kind of winding that process up. So I wanted to kind of go over that and where that's been, and then talk a little bit about like if we were going to move forward from my own experience and kind of the recommendations, how that might happen and how it relates to design, because there's a ton of competition for space, whether it's public right-of-way or in relationship to building projects. And bike share is sometimes a challenging thing to cite and cite well. And so, like I said, the feasibility study was actually a partnership between the Downtown Development Authority, DGRI, and the city. Initially, it had come out of the GR Forward plan, which of course is a fairly sort of a downtown focus. They do talk about linking to neighborhoods a lot, but it is of course a downtown focused plan. They talk a little bit about like having bike rentals in other plans, and then just there's a growing interest in bicycling in general. This is light years different than when I left a long time ago, when bicycling was not super popular. It was typically a recreational thing for the most part. Now you see a lot of people riding for all kinds of purposes. I rode this morning to work, and I wasn't the only person out there. And there's actually now much more of a city commitment to having a multimodal transportation system, trying to support things other than just driving by yourself in your car and parking somewhere, but actually supporting carpooling, transit use, curbside management for using ride-hailing services, and transit and bicycling and walking. And so one of the things, we had a pretty broad-based steering committee made up of various types of players from around the community and organizations. Some of the key things that they did was establish some system goals based on a lot of feedback that we had. We had a pretty robust public engagement process, which Amanda knows well about. We spent a lot of hours last fall out connecting with the community at their events predominantly, and also doing a lot of focus groups with lower income individuals and persons of color, using partnerships with the Hispanic Center and Link Up. And some of the key decisions were like, are we even going to go forward with this? What kind of equipment or system would we actually have? What do you think makes sense for Grand Rapids? Because there's several different types of models. How would we own it? How would we operate it? And then different types of things about user pricing and general structure. The plan also looked into proposed service areas, although that's very fluid. And there's a lot of things that affect how you grow a bike share system, one of which is funding, and not just the amount, but where it comes from can have a big effect on how you build out your system. And then what would the actual capital and operating costs? This is a public transportation service, basically. And so kind of try to use those proposed service areas to extrapolate out what might be a capital cost to put a system on the ground over time, and then what would the ongoing operating costs be, and how would you get system revenues, not just from user fees or what we call fare box revenue, to take a term from transit, but also what other revenue sources can you bring in through bike share. So the goals were focused on a number of things. One, financial sustainability was a big one, and also minimizing the need for city funds to go towards ongoing operational dollars. And those are actually two fairly common ones. Very few locations that I'm aware of in the United States actually rely on municipal funds for ongoing operations. For the most part, municipalities' involvement has almost always been on the front end of supporting capital, whether it's like we did in Milwaukee. I was tasked to do this and went out and got a lot of grant dollars, and we were funding grant matches and staff time. That's often very common. It isn't super common to see cities continuously paying for ongoing operating expenses. Many of these systems are actually running in the black fairly early, which is unheard of typically for public transportation. And so accessibility was really important. They wanted to focus on reaching as many people as possible. It wasn't just visitors. It wasn't just millennials. It wasn't just people with money. They wanted to reach as broad a range of people in the community so that this is actually a transportation option that can be used for all types of purposes. They wanted to extend the reach of public transportation, increasing access to the city, whether you're through your visitor experience or as a resident, and whatever purpose. Of course, visitor experience is a big one, and bike share systems are often largely successful because of the use of visitors. They tend to pay more for their use than regular users, just because they have a little less price conscious. They're happy to just pay to use that and then they have the experience while they're in town. We, of course, want to foster what we call park once behaviors, which is if you are going to drive in or maybe you're carpooling, put your car in once and then use other means of getting around, whether you've gone for a recreational or a entertainment purpose. Say you've come downtown for the evening, you park your car on a west side lot for $2, use a dash or maybe take a bike share, and then you circulate around to your destinations. Maybe it's a concert, maybe it's dinner, maybe it's drinks after. Or is it using the same thing? You've carpooled and used this during the day. You've maybe taken the bus, used this during the day to get around. I even would ride a bike most days in Milwaukee, and I would use bike share during the day. I didn't want to drag my bike out of parking, worry about a lock, put on my special shoes because I have to use special pedals. So it was easier to go down and grab a bike share bike. And then, of course, it was very important that we got people using and being more physically active. There's a challenge with physical activity around the United States in general with obesity, and it's unfortunately a challenge in particular in the Midwest and in Michigan. So how many people have used bike share here? Okay, so a decent amount. So bike share is actually a type of on-demand public transit system. It isn't necessarily all about the bikes. It's really about convenience and the quality of the experience that you're using a lot. The bike just happens to be the vehicle of choice. But it has a lot in common with transit in terms of how it developed and how it operates. So typically there's some type of station or hub. You check out a bike, maybe there's a kiosk or maybe you're a pass holder, and you grab the bike and you go. It's pretty simple. You find another location to dock it in. It's your destination and walk to where you're going to be. This is actually one that was in Milwaukee, and it's down by our public market. And this was one of the most heavily used stations, simply because everybody would ping back and forth, whether it's coffee, get food, buy stuff, meet for drinks, dinner, whatever. It was a very popular location, and there were offices and apartments and restaurant across the street. There was a lot going on here. And so part of this process, I said there's key decisions. The decisions that have come out of this feasibility study here is that, yes, they think we should go forward. The steering committee is making that recommendation, which is going to be taken forward to the Downtown Development Authority, the Mobile GR Commission, which is sort of our transportation commission, and then eventually the City Commission. There was, A, they feel it's feasible based on our process, but B, there was a huge amount of public interest. Anywhere we went, people were like, wow, this seems like a great idea. Why haven't we had this? And they seemed to get that they could use it for lots of different things, whether it was trip making for trip purposes, for more utilitarian, as well as the opportunity to use it recreationally or with friends and family visitors. And then a lot of people saw it as an asset for the visitors that do come to Grand Rapids, whether it's Art Prize or other types of activities that go on throughout the year. Grand Rapids has always been a fairly event-driven city, and it's substantially more so over the last 20 years. We had a lot of conversation about system type, because this is where we're seeing a lot of changes in the industry. A lot of people, if you've been following it, there's a lot of chatter about what we call dockless bike share, which is basically a bike that's smart, and you check out the bike and you can leave it anywhere. Station-based systems have been the sort of a stalwart. That's where you see most places. And then there's sort of an in-between where you have sort of smart bikes with dumb hubs, if you will. So they're still functioning like a station, but the bike is still smart. There was a recommendation to kind of go in between and find a system where you can have stations plus hubs and smart bikes all together to have more flexibility in how you build out a system and how it's able to be used. And then there's also been a lot of conversation about buying bikes that are electric assist. That's coming along as an industry in general. It's one of the fastest growing components of the bike industry. And you're starting to see e-bikes or e-assist bikes and bike share more commonly. Some of that is it's a little bit easier entry to people who aren't cyclists. And plus we have some crazy hills, especially coming out of downtown to the east where we have a lot of demand or potential demand with dense housing. You've got a lot of major employers. You've got Grand Valley and GRCC up the hill. There's just a lot of activity, and not to be able to reach that easily. I don't even reach that easily on my regular bike, and I ride all the time. So having electric assist, I think, is a positive. Talked a lot about ownership model. There's lots of different operations. So anybody use Chicago's system, Divvy? That is largely driven by the city, but they have a private operating company who operates it for them. Other cities, Milwaukee was a little bit different. We owned all the equipment as a city, so we owned the asset, but we had a collaboration with a nonprofit that we essentially sort of helped birth, if you will. And so ours was a little different. We had a nonprofit public-private partnership, and that's fairly common in sort of mid-sized cities and mid-sized systems. There's very few fully privately owned, privately operated. And so the recommendation did come out that we should try to do public ownership of the assets and nonprofit operator in Grand Rapids. Like I said, it tends to follow that model pretty heavily in a lot of mid-sized cities, and it's been working well. So hybrid system, like I said, stations that are smart, or have kiosks and checkout, and then also be able to use smart bikes with hubs maybe in areas where you have a little less density or you're still growing out into those areas and those neighborhoods are changing. Those could eventually someday become stations that are fully automated, and then having the bikes where the actual checkout mechanism can also be on the bike, not just in a kiosk at a station. And then like I said, we talked about using electric assist bikes as part of the fleet to kind of open things up and make it more palatable and reasonable to tackle parts of Grand Rapids. So just an idea, if this is a typical station up in the top where there's some type of map and ad panel on the end. There's what they call docks that lock those bikes in, and then the kiosk you can check out at. The smart bike with the sort of dumb hubs, the bike actually loops around a bike rack type thing. But then the checkout component, if you can see, is on the back of that white bike. So you can check out at that, or you can check out at a kiosk if you're at a station. And then the other advantage is that these are actually can be geo-fenced. So if you want, you can actually leave that bike potentially at a bike rack within a certain service area, and someone could find that bike again and go check it out. So it has sort of these benefits of being sort of a range of being station-based all the way down to being almost sort of semi-dockless. And a lot more flexibility in how you build and operate your system. Does that all make sense? I know it's a lot of techie stuff in like one dose. So, and so, like I said, the flexibility to build out. We have a lot of proven vendors between station and hub-based equipment. Dockless is a little unproven, quite unproven still. The fully true dockless systems, and some of the biggest challenges that they've had have been just clutter in the right-of-way. We have enough problems with people managing how to put a sidewalk sign in, like a sandwich board properly, or setting up their street cafe furniture in compliance. So the idea of having thousands of people try to figure out how they should properly park a bike anywhere is a little bit daunting, and has created some clutter challenges and a lot of impounding in some cities of bikes that have been left in places that they shouldn't be left in. And one of the conversations that the committee had was that those system goals that they had, they just felt having kind of a system that hybrid system met more of their goals, as well as the operation, keeping that nonprofit with a city ownership. They could control things like having a stronger push towards a more equitable system early on, rather than a system being driven to where solely revenue is going to be generated. And so that's been the equipment recommendation that sort of ekes back to those goals. One of the other things we talked about, we modeled a lot, was user pricing recommendations. We did a lot of sort of price sensitivity conversations during the public engagement. We have to make it affordable and attractive, otherwise people won't use it. I know that was one of the challenges with the sort of pilot that came out a few years ago. The price was quite high. It was almost $5 to use it, which is quite a bit higher than most bike share systems around the country. Sometimes pricing structures are unclear. There's too many pricing options, so keeping it simple is important. We obviously have to generate revenue from user fees to help support the system. We've talked a lot about pass integration. These are all what we call RFID type passes, and so can you, say, combine these with a transit pass and buy one pass that can do both? Can you combine it with our parking passes at the city? So you could buy a parking pass, maybe you're a regular parker, but you also want to use bike share as a way you get around in between parking. And then also creating options beyond using credit or debit cards. Most of you, if you've used bike share in another city, you've just, slid your card in, checked out a bike, but there are certainly people that are unbanked. And so how do you get them access to this while still connecting their use to that bike from a security standpoint? And then finally, looking at pricing points for persons that meet certain income levels, and again, to encourage access to this option, and then also student price passes. So those kind of things are fairly common in other cities. It's just how you roll that out. And so we kind of modeled a $20 a month bike share pass, which would be unlimited rides up to 60 minutes each ride. Some cities do 30 minutes. I know Chicago does that. We opted in Milwaukee to do 60 because most trips were still under 30, and being able to offer 60 seemed to erase a lot of anxiety people had about getting the bike back to another station, even though they didn't really use the time. So we were offering something that generally didn't get used, but it made people feel better, so that's a good thing. Transit passes are $40, and of course, owning and operating a personal vehicle can be pretty expensive on a monthly basis. So, and a lot of people, even in the focus groups that we did, felt that that was a pretty good price point, even though a lot of people we met with in focus groups could possibly qualify for, say, a pass that was income-based pass in the future. Many of them were like, yeah, $20, it sounds good. So proposed service areas, like I said, this is developing a bike share system is somewhat of an art. We did draw a very distinct boundary, which is the black dotted line. Nothing will ever actually build that way, but it's very fluid when you do this, but we needed something to do modeling and do cost estimating. So the phase 1 service area is kind of inside those dotted black lines, and it's about a 4.5 square mile area. The population in there is just under 30,000, but interestingly, when we looked within a quarter mile of boundaries, that population increased to over 60,000 people, just within that, right around the edges of that. So we get a lot of jobs because obviously it incorporates downtown, it incorporates Spectrum Health and Grand Valley's campus and some of the other major employers. It incorporates about 15% of the non-white population, about 22% under the poverty line, another quarter of zero vehicle households, and then the household income is about $34,000, which is lower than the typical income in Grand Rapids. So we're hitting a lot of people who are of more modest incomes. Now, if we go into that bigger area all the way out to the yellow edges, it's a huge area to service over time. It certainly would be something that you build out incrementally. Population increases substantially. Population density is about the same. The jobs increases, but it's not huge. It's coming up another 20 some thousand jobs. Obviously, we start capturing a much larger percentage of non-white population, persons under the poverty line, and zero vehicle households, but the median income stays about the same. So we're still capturing a much bigger share of persons that fall under the standard median income, which is, I think, about 42 or 43,000 in Grand Rapids. And like I said, with the arrows, things are sort of growing, as you would grow, you sort of grow incrementally over time. And there might be spines. Maybe there might be a spine out into Millennium Trail. There might be a spine that takes you up to Riverside Park, where a lot of people like to ride. But again, those aren't major drivers of any kind of regular utilitarian trips. Those are likely to be people wanting to do something recreational or visitor based. But again, this is kind of the snapshot. So we estimated out based on all the things that we've they've agreed upon the types of equipment and the types of operating model. Probably about $3 million to build out the capital for a system that would cover that full area. That wouldn't happen overnight. No system grows, from 0 to 100 overnight. And it doesn't necessarily take into consideration things like depreciation and replacement of equipment. Most equipment is lasting quite a while. Some of the oldest systems in Denver and Minneapolis are only now starting to replace their equipment 10 years in, which is on par with public transit. You see them replacing bus vehicles about every 8 to 12 years, depending on use. And so that's sort of the proposed suggested size of the system, whether it's that smaller service area, that 4.5 miles, or the larger 13 miles. We took a look at how much it would cost to run a system on an annual basis. So breaking down by bike, even though this is not just maintaining the bike, it's everything on top of that, the overhead, probably around $2,400 a bike, and that's pretty conservative. And then, so if you just did annual maintenance, about a little over $1 million every year to own and to sort of operate that system. That's staffing, that's, space to lease, that's resetting bikes if they get lopsided, that's repairs, that's any kind of damage, it's paying benefits, insurance. And then if we expanded in the full service area, it goes up maybe about $2 million. There are ways to do cost savings on a lot of this. I know in Milwaukee we were really good at getting a lot of donations, or low cost. There's a lot of people interested in being part of bike share. So we had a reset vehicle, a van that a lease company literally gave us for a free lease for 3 months or 3 years. We had free operating space for the first 3 years, thanks to a generous development company who gave us some unbuilt, sort of like built out space, basically right in downtown. And so there's a lot of ways to develop community partnerships to kind of bring some of those costs down, and have them being able to provide resources that you need in ways that aren't just necessarily straight up cash. And so system revenues, this is always a challenge. It's like how many people are actually going to be riding the system. And as you expand your system and have more bikes and stations and hubs, you can actually generate more revenue. And so a lot of it, this was the panic page when we'd show this, was like, oh my gosh, we have this much what they call a shortfall of revenue. But much of that can be brought back through additional revenues, such as advertising on the bikes. You can actually advertise on the bikes. We do have a restriction on advertising in the public right-of-way right now. So a lot of systems will advertise on the stations, much like you see transit advertising in bus shelters in other cities. We are going to be having a conversation about that in the city, if we can open that door again. The transit agency is very interested in that as well. They'd like to offer more waiting environment amenities, but one of the biggest challenges is the ongoing operating costs, and this is the same conversation. But in many cases, you can get a lot of this revenue back through other sources. And so this one doesn't make me sweat as much as I think some people initially thought we should. And obviously, when we're building out in the first few years, you have greater expenses because more of your dollars are going to capital expenses. I talked about sources of additional revenue. The biggest ones that get used are sponsorships of whether it's a full system, some type of title sponsorship. So people sort of like City Bike in New York. Maybe there's a presenting sponsorship. So Divvy in Chicago is presented by Blue Cross. And then station sponsorships, this is what we did. This was the bread and butter in Milwaukee. We didn't have some big company who wanted to come in and present the system, but we had nearly every station sponsored by some company or organization, maybe a business improvement district. We had a couple of those as well. But different types of entities coming in, whether it was, we had US Bank sponsor station, we had a fairly large brewery, not founder size, but it was like a Vermont size. Each of them were paying the money to sponsor, and that station was presented by that company. And then we've been seen where it's getting down to individual bikes. I know the system in Hamilton, Ontario, I have a good friend who works there. And you can actually, as an individual, sponsor a bike and have the bike named how you would like. So she has one named after her mom. So it's Velma Vroom is the name of the bike. And then, sometimes it's kind of fun. There's people who find it and then you can post on social media that you found someone's bike, but really being creative about how you sponsor things. Advertising revenue, of course, on the bikes, what kind of web platform you have, any kind of merchandise. I would bring, Bubbler was the name of our system in Milwaukee. I'd bring Bubbler merchandise to bike share events around the country, conferences, and everybody be like, we totally want the Bubbler swag. Everybody wanted our stuff, and you could buy it, and people would be buying T-shirts and stickers and all kinds of things. And then there's also just promotional materials and other that generated a lot of interest. In-kind donations I mentioned. We had free legal services, for example, which is huge, from a lawyer legal firm there. It's one of the largest legal firms. They offered us free legal services along with some of these other things I mentioned. And then the other one is that you continuously are out there looking for grants or private funds. And a lot of times the grants, whether it's foundational grants or other kind of things you can get that can support certain initiatives you might have, whether it's specific outreach you're trying to do, or maybe you're trying to grow into an area to support your equity initiatives to get bike share into a broader base in the community. So the next steps with this process is we're finalizing a study report and a strategic business plan to go through that. And then we've been to the first two bodies right now already for a briefing. We're going to be going to the City Commission on the 27th of February to do a fairly detailed briefing and then get some feedback on what else they feel they would want or need to hear. We are going to kind of delay any kind of action on it because we're in the process of developing the city's first bicycle plan. And so we want to bring this back as a component of that and as a recommendation coming out of the bike plan. So those three bodies, again, will come back at it and have the opportunity to take action and see if maybe we'll be moving forward as a community with bike share. So I'm thinking that's more like early summer, early to midsummer. Now, as far as how it relates with system planning, is there any questions about where we've been, at least locally here? Okay. All right. So having built a system in another city, I didn't have a feasibility study when I came to Milwaukee. They just said, we're doing this, make it work. So it was essentially building a public transportation system with no plan from the ground up. And so I was new to town. I had to learn town really fast. And a lot of it was getting together with a lot of different types of colleagues, particularly in planning, who were heavily engaged in whether it was neighborhood planning, downtown planning, strategic corridor planning, to understand, and then sort of the development review process to understand, because we were having a lot of sort of boom construction activity and infill development, much like you're seeing here in Grand Rapids. And so a lot was changing. And we had a lot of constraints on our public right-of-way. And so people are like, oh, things are small and narrow here. And I'm like, well, you've never been to Milwaukee, where I have 8-foot sidewalks from the face of the building to the curb in a lot of places, including downtown. Very tight and constrained locations. And there's a lot of competitions, parking meters and street trees and hydrants and park mobile stations and anything that you can think of, street lighting, all those things, lots of landscaping. And of course, we love landscaping here, and we love features in the public right-of-way. We love our green infrastructure. And every time I turn around, I'm like, I don't know how I'd fit a bike share station anywhere in some of these blocks. But the big thing with system planning is density and spacing is really critical. So there's always this political push a lot of times to just spread it all out so everybody gets something. And that's like the worst thing you can do for bike share. The worst thing you can do is just dilute it and spread it out so it's really so far to get between stations. It's not super attractive. People are walking really far. They're not going to use it. It has to be really convenient. And so I think New York City is at almost 30 stations per square mile. Obviously a super dense city. We were probably in the network place about 10 to 12 per square mile in Milwaukee, but we were still in build-out phase. The big thing is convenience. They talk about having a station every 1,000 feet in your densest areas and then no more than a quarter mile apart, much like transit, talking about that quarter mile walk to transit. If it isn't convenient, people aren't really going to use it unless they just really want to use it or they have no other option. Like I said, low station and hub density is generally a poor service quality and actually saps your ridership and really isn't going to create a system. And that's hard to sometimes politically say to people. You've got different players wanting to see things. I already kind of got an earful from one neighborhood business district who like, why aren't we in the phase 1 area? And I'm like, well, you're kind of about 3.5 miles from downtown. I'm sorry, it will likely get there, and probably fairly quickly, the way that the development is sort of going in these spines up certain corridors, but it probably isn't going to be there certainly the first year, maybe not the first 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. And they're like, oh, well, we're going to have to work on that. And I'm like, okay. See, now if you bring revenues to the table, that's another story. And actually, there's a really good article, if people want to follow up, a lot about station spacing and bike share. People for Bikes had a really good blog post, and it has a lot of links to other things. There's been some actually good research about it. NACTO, which is the North American City Transportation Officials Organization, has done a lot of research about walkable station spacing and how it's just not only critical to good operations and access, but it's actually critical to better system equity for people of all levels, income levels, and communities of color. So this is a picture of the system I left behind in Milwaukee. And obviously we didn't get very far out of downtown. And people were kind of shocked. We had just rows of stations, block by block by block by block, maybe 2 blocks apart throughout downtown. And they're like, why are you putting them so close together? And I'm like, they get used. They all get used. Almost all of those were some of our highest used stations, even though they were close together. But there was so much density and so much activity. And then we were sort of filtering them out up and through the Upper East Side. And then we had a big partnership with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which is up in the northern part. They came in and was the first university to actually put student money. Their students voted to spend $300,000 to bring bike share to their campus early, not later, which we actually had an island of stations sitting up there, which sort of forced the issue of me filling in as much as I could afford to, because we had a pod and a pod, like 2 islands, and it was a nightmare to operate for about a year. Because the students were using the bikes like crazy up here, and they weren't mixing necessarily in between. And so that was a challenge to operate. And then we're dipping over across the freeway a little bit near Marquette University. We have a big hole near that Haymarket Schlitz Park area because I could never find anything public in a redevelopment of the old Pabst Brewing site. And so negotiating to put stations on private property takes a lot of time. And then we started to trickle down south of the freeway in what they call the 3rd Ward. Again, that's a little more challenging area. It's a hugely historic area. Again, took just time to negotiate each location. And also was experiencing a lot of development. So we were actually pinging stations with new development and attaching them to those developments as opposed to running in there and putting them out ahead of time. And then we were slowly trickling south. And then we have our one lone guy down here, which was funded through a grant near a community health center in the Hispanic south side of Milwaukee. And that was a very political station, and it was functioning badly because it was just out there sort of by itself. But it was the start of putting stations into the south side. But it's all quite dense, and like I said, we didn't reach out, and even into the River and West neighborhood, which is up in the corner there. This is a very hipster, bike-oriented neighborhood who was really angry at me for not putting any stations up there for a while, but I was like, we can't dilute the network. We'll get there, we'll get there, maybe not with our first couple million, but we'll get there with the next couple million. And they're starting to see stations trickling across the river up into River West, and then again across the freeway into some of our lower income neighborhoods that ring downtown. We had an objective to get stations next to a lot of our low income housing sites and neighborhoods that kind of ring downtown. So a number of those locations are right at public housing neighborhoods immediately adjacent to them. And that was a goal that we had. So in terms of station and hub siting, one of the big things that when I've dealt with, whether it was architects, developers, they never assume how large these things are. Now it depends on the equipment you buy, but if I wanted to put a station in that was going to serve a lot of people, I need about 60 feet in length, which if you can imagine trying to find that kind of space in a public environment in a dense area, 60 feet is really tough. And I need at least about 11 foot of depth to handle the station, plus the ability to actually back the bike out. And so I've had developments come in. We'd look at development review, and they would propose things. And I would sort of chuckle at this area that they might want to propose for the bike share system or the bike share station, because it was usually extremely undersized and often poorly located based on the ability of people to access the station. So we never built anything smaller than a 13 dock station. It doesn't actually give you any operational benefit. It actually is more costly to operate a bunch of tiny little stations. And that's a sort of an advantage of going to that hybrid system. If you have stations plus you have hubs, which are a little bit cheaper to operate, you could put smaller, more frequent hubs in a neighborhood as the system is building out and as demand is getting stronger. And so having that flexibility to build that way. So this was an actual proposal for a mixed-use development in Milwaukee. And I remember this one coming in because they initially proposed to put a station up where the red circle was. And of course, it was completely undersized, right next to all the sidewalk cafes. There's apartments and offices and retail in this building. And I just said, wow, how is it that you think that's a great idea? Because it's up a bunch of stairs and a ramp, and and they said, oh, it'll be really visible. And I'm like, well, number one, I need about 3 times the size you're giving me. And no, I don't think it's a great idea to have that up there and then have people trying to maneuver down a ramp or a bunch of stairs to get down to the side street or to the main street out here. And so we ended up negotiating to cut into their green infrastructure pond area. And so that's where it's going. They were under construction. It was a grocery store and all kinds of stuff was going to be in here. So we're actually negotiated public right-of-way behind the sidewalk, a new section of public right-of-way, because we need to retain a certain amount of clearance. So we had about 7 feet behind the sidewalk. We used the actual sidewalk space to back the bikes in and out. And then we set a new right-of-way line with the development. And then we did adjustments on things like their landscape requirements and their green infrastructure requirements. And so that's just one real world kind of example. I've also had developments come in where they showed bike share as their bike parking. And I was like, no, bike share isn't bike parking. Those are two separate, very separate things. And so if we're going to talk bike share, your bike parking is another conversation. Station hub siding, like I said, there's a lot of competition for space in the right of way. There's not only surface considerations, but a lot of subterranean considerations. You have to have power unless you're going to put solar, and solar doesn't work super well in the Midwest or the Northeast, especially if you have building shade and tree cover, urban tree canopy. Funding sources can severely affect your siting locations. So I was working with largely federal money, and that means nothing with those dollars can go on public or on private property. You cannot put it on there. And if you start wanting to put it in parks or other locations, you start to trigger a lot of paperwork. If you're spending federal money in a park, it's about an extra 9 to 12 months of paperwork to review. Historic districts and designations and other types of overlays also create more layers that you need to go through. And power availability, I talked about that, and service access, the ability to service that station, whether it's make repairs, pick up and drop off bikes, or reset. Those are just some of the things that we looked at. I actually had a whole checklist every time we would go through and look at a site. So here's the one I showed earlier by the public market, and I've got a historic building inside a historic district. I've got an extremely wide sidewalk for Milwaukee, which is unheard of for the most part. I have the state requirement to keep 2 feet at least behind the curb. We try to do more than 2 feet, simply for snow storage. And then this was also a loading zone adjacent to it. Or if you had on-street parking, the ability to swing doors open to get in and out. And then on the far side there, I had a signal cabinet that I needed to stay away from at least 2 feet. So there's a lot of factors going on. But it's a high visibility location directly across the street from the public market. But I also had to go through an entire historic screening process to get it approved. and also go through our local historic designation or review process and our third ward architectural review board just to get the station approved. And so there's a lot of steps and stages to go through. Now it's obviously here, but it took a lot. And of course, having some public engagement. Thankfully, the people in this building, there's condos with offices, were thrilled to death to have a bike share station out front. That's not necessarily always the case. This one was a more unique one on a street called Brady Street, which is one of the most unique business district streets in the country. It's almost largely, it's like the highest concentration of all local business anywhere in the country. But again, pretty narrow sidewalks and not a lot of opportunity to put stations along the street because of a lot of constraints. Tons of sidewalk cafes. So a lot of, like I said, a lot of competition. This is actually a historic church and was the cleanest location to put one. We negotiated with the church. They were happy to have it alongside. But again, historic clearances, their church board, the Brady Street Business Improvement District, all these people are signing off on this and I'm literally slammed up against their building. And then they turned around and said, by the way, we'll be happy to power it. So they piped out power to us rather than us having to figure out how to pull it from our street lights under the sidewalk. So, and then they ended up having the pastor bless the station to open it. And so it was a good partnership, and it's one that because a lot of people say you can't do bike share in historic areas, and I'm like, I think you can, including right up against the side of a beautiful historic Catholic church. This is another location at one of our lower income neighborhoods where I've got a bazillion little different things along the way, and we ended up breaking the station up in two pieces. And we had to do this at a number of locations. You have to be a little creative, and this is when you rely on your fantastic electricians that work for your municipality about piping everything under, and then we have the ability to even go beyond that next street tree when we want to expand and make a third connection. But we're not tearing down trees, we're not moving utilities, and we don't have a lot of space to work with. We have only 6 feet there behind the bikes to the wall of the building. And we need to retain some clearance. This is heavily used parking along here, so you got to open the door. So it's a lot to squeeze in a small space. But it was other than just a little piping and connections with electricians, it was a low-cost improvement to get in there. And then my favorite station. So everybody wants to be along the lakefront in Milwaukee. We have a beautiful trail system up and down it. All of it, of course, is owned by the Milwaukee County Parks, practically, which if I want to put federal money down here means I add about 9 months to a year to my approval process, which the public doesn't really understand. They're like, why the hell do you not have a station up at the beach? And so we did a query. One of my interns, I said, I want you to query for every piece of city or utility property you can find. And we actually owned across the street. This is a waterworks property, so it doesn't classify as parks property. Thank God. And people were pissed that we weren't putting it on the beach side. But I said, if you want that one, it's going to be a year from now, not now. And so we ended up proposing it on that side, convincing the head of the waterworks, who thought this was a bunch of crap. She said, well, I just want to make sure that when it fails, you'll put that back the way you found it. And we also don't own this road. We don't own the power along this road. So this is one of the few stations we did solar. Even though we have a very cooperative county parks department and county road commission, the county elected officials wouldn't sign off on us tapping in. So we ended up doing a solar station, but we have good solar gain out here. There's not a lot of conflicts. But we did have to go through a few steps. This is all historic. The whole lakefront is historic. So again, our own historic process, the state's historic process through the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, and then we also have a Lake Michigan Commission. So I had to go and present to the Lake Michigan Commission as well. And so each one of these, I can see somebody shaking their head back there. So each one of these locations, and there's some that were cleaner, but for the most part, there was a lot to do for most of these locations. But we ended up, and I don't have a final picture, but we actually ended up doing a station that's double-sided, so they come in both ways. But you just cross the street with a signal. You get off your bike, cross the street. The trail is actually right there. And the green line, that sidewalk there is a wide trail, and there's on both sides of the street. You can ride there, park your bike, push the button, and walk across the street, and you're at the beach, and you're at the custard stand, and so from a convenience standpoint, it's still pretty reasonably convenient. So just wanted to give you an idea what life is like when you have to build a transportation system quickly and in a constrained environment. I would suspect we do a lot of the same processes here. I think we have a little more generous room to work with. Like I said, the color of money will affect it a lot. If we find we have more private dollars coming in for capital, we have a lot more flexibility on what to do with that. We were negotiating some locations with developments, although we were very constrained by state law about we couldn't require it. And we have similar constraints here about what we can require. But there were a number of developers or developments that were happy to put them in. To them, a $50,000 investment in a bike share system or station at their site or right across the street was a pretty low investment compared to the scale of many of the developments that they were putting in. And so, like we were doing a new headquarters with Northwestern Mutual, and they were also building an apartment tower next door to house potential employees. And they were happy to fork over money for 2 stations, which $100,000 out of a few $100 million, couple projects was nothing, was really nothing. And to them, they saw it as an asset. But we also saw even small developers doing the same thing. I had a infill down in the neighborhood I was living in, one of the first stations that would go down there. He's renovating a building and he's building out maybe, I want to say 12 units with retail on the bottom. And we went out and talked about it, and he wrote a check on site. Said, I want that station, so let's make this happen. I mean, the station was there long before his building was even there. So there's ways that it's positive to work with the development community, and a lot of it is trying to get in during their processes and see how it works with your station siting.